Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Brookings. My name is Ted Gayer. I'm the Vice President and Director of Economic Studies here at Brookings, and I also direct the Center on Regulation and Markets, which is hosting this event today. And I am delighted to welcome Neomi Rao to speak here today. She is the Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, for everybody in this room and in this town, commonly known as OIRA. Just if you don't know that, that's the lingo. Her appearance today is reminding me of one of the first events I ever did here at Brookings. I hosted, it was probably 8 years ago, Cass Sunstein, who was then the OIRA Administrator. It's one of my first events. I was a little bit nervous, so I was walking around outside, getting warmed up, and there was a group of protesters out front, one of whom was wearing a full-on Oscar the Grouch costume with the trash can, a sign, a face sign of Cass in front of him. I think it was a him. It's hard to tell behind the Oscar uniform or costume. And they were singing a very creatively written song called I Love Ash, for all of you Sesame Street watchers. That was a play on Oscar's famous song, I Love Trash. And it was incredibly creative, and I will say it was effective because without that, I would never have remembered the coal ash disposal rule. So there you go. I'm going to say perhaps thankfully, this is guardedly, there's nothing so exciting happening outside the room today, which I think is well enough. But the story does highlight a serious point, which is that the job of OIRA Administrator is almost always controversial, and it is frequently contentious. OIRA oversees the regulatory process for the executive agencies. It's responsible for vetting the agency's tallies of the benefits and costs of federal regulations. It could sink a rule or turn it back to the agencies for reconsideration. So it's an incredibly powerful position and office within the federal government. The OIRA Administrator is frequently called the regulatory czar. They're again giving you a sense of the power of the position. And today, given the current administration and their emphasis and primary emphasis on deregulation, perhaps Administrator Rao's role is arguably more influential than ever. Thankfully, she is exceptionally well qualified for the job. Before joining the Trump administration, she was an associate professor of law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. While she was there, she founded the Center for the Study of the Administrative State. Before joining George Mason, she served in all three branches of government. She was counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee under Senator Orrin Hatch. She clerked for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, and she served as associate counsel and special assistant to President George W. Bush. So again, I'm delighted to have her here. The plan for today is she will speak for approximately 20 minutes. Then I will join her on stage for some question and answers, and then we will turn to all of you for further questions and answers from her as well. So with that, please join me in welcoming Administrator Rao.
Great. Thanks so much to Ted for inviting me to be here with you today, and to Brookings for hosting this event. Every time I have a public appearance, I ask my staff and my close advisors for jokes, and I have to say, no one ever comes up with any. And I try to joke about the fact that we don't have any jokes. And you know, my chief of staff has said to me, you know, Neomi, you're the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. It's just not funny. So sorry, I have no jokes for you today yet again. We'll see if I can do better next time. But basically, in my remarks today, I wanted to discuss the regulatory reform efforts of this administration and to focus on three main points. I wanted to speak a little bit about what we've done in this past year, what we plan to do in the upcoming year, and then to give you some of the reasons, some of the principles why we believe so strongly in our regulatory reform efforts. So first, a little bit about what we've done. So from my perspective, this past year was really a banner year for regulatory reform. Soon after taking office, the president issued a very ambitious series of executive orders that directed agencies to eliminate 2 regulations for each new one and to impose 0 regulatory costs in fiscal year 2017. And when those executive orders came out, there was a lot of skepticism. But I think when you look back on the past year, I think what we see is that those executive orders focused attention on a very big problem of cumulative regulations. And the administration didn't go after the problem with little scissors, but really with something much more like the big, beautiful gold scissors that the president used to cut the red tape at his December speech. So the president directed the agencies to deregulate, and that's what they've been doing. And some of the ways we've done this, the administration has really slowed the production of new costly regulations. We issued only 3 significant new regulations in fiscal year 2017. We've tried to really redirect the regulatory inertia, and as part of our effort to change the culture around regulation, we withdrew or delayed more than 1,500 planned rules. Now, those are rules that are currently in process and rules that we're thinking about, but it demonstrates the magnitude of what has been halted or postponed. And I think it also shows that what the administration is doing is that we are carefully reconsidering the direction, the scope, and the content of many proposed regulations. Across the government, we've also eliminated 22 regulatory actions for every 1 new regulation, a ratio that far exceeds the 2-for-1 that the president called for. And we've kept the total cost of executive agency regulations to below 0 for the first time in our records. In fact, according to OIRA's own, frankly, quite conservative calculations, we've had a total net savings from these reductions of over $8 billion. And to provide some context about what this kind of reduction means, historically over time, regulatory costs have increased in administrations of both parties. And in the previous administration, during just their last 8 months, they imposed annualized regulatory costs of over $15 billion. And we're planning to continue this in 2018. For this fiscal year, agencies have committed to reducing regulatory costs even further by more than $10 billion. So how have we been doing this? I've gotten a lot of questions about implementation. And these are some really significant reforms that we've had to put in place. And we've been working with the OIRA staff to do this. As some of you may know, OIRA has really a quite small staff. We have about 45 career officials, and they're really, really excellent. And they have been working closely with the career civil servants in other agencies to implement the president's executive orders in a way that is both careful and responsible. And I think one thing to just highlight about what we've been doing is we've tried to be exceptionally transparent in how we have calculated 2-for-1 and the cost savings. We've really focused on developing a system that would meet the president's goals. Right? We want real reduction in regulatory burdens, and we wanted to incentivize agencies to eliminate and to streamline burdens of all sizes. And while we were doing this, we also wanted to maintain the very high standards of regulatory analysis that we expect from agencies. At OIRA, we provided advanced guidance of how we would be implementing the executive orders, and we've shown all of our final work on our website. I think if you take a look there, you'll see that the numbers demonstrate a kind of fundamental reorientation of the regulatory system. As I've said, we've slowed the pace of new significant rules, but also, frankly, of many smaller rules. We have eliminated many costly regulatory actions, which includes rules, but also guidance documents and information collections. And we have pushed agencies to be very open in their actions and not simply to redirect their regulatory activity to guidance or other sub-regulatory forms of actions. And I also like to say we welcome input about our system because we're continuing to implement these far-reaching reforms, and we're working on improving our process both in working with agencies and informing the public. So while we've been working through the requirements of these executive orders, we've also sought to continue and to further institutionalize long-standing good government regulatory practices. So again, on the theme of transparency, as I'm sure many of you know, OIRA publishes annually a unified agenda of regulatory and deregulatory actions. And in this past summer, when we updated the agenda, we released for the first time a list of inactive items. And this was a list that was long maintained by administrations that included items agencies were considering promulgating, but that they didn't want to be on the agenda. And that list was never made public. We've now made that list public, so people have information about all of the different potential regulatory and deregulatory actions agencies might be considering. And now that this information is all publicly available, it's all on our websites, we are working with agencies to remove stale items from the agenda. I understand that there's some items in some agencies that are left over from the George W. Bush administration. So we're really pushing to make sure that our agenda reflects real agency priorities, and so the public can have a much better sense of what's coming. We've also made a number of technical changes. The agenda is now searchable by regulatory and deregulatory actions, and my staff is also in a process of working on making some of these changes consistent with the Federal Register with new rules going forward. And so while there have been new reforms, there is also, I think, a lot of continuity in what we're doing. We're continuing at OIRA to follow longstanding principles of centralized regulatory review that you can find in Executive Order 12866 that was issued by President Clinton. We're continuing with the same cost-benefit standards that have been in OMB Circular A4. So that's about some of the technical parts of this. Our regulatory reform efforts, too, I wanted to note, go beyond just some of the numbers that you can see on our website. They go beyond these individual deregulatory actions. We're also kind of systematically trying to crack down on bad regulatory practices and make sure that agencies are proceeding in a manner that is consistent with law. And even when an agency has legal authority to proceed, we want to make sure that they are working to solve an actual problem, right? We want to make sure there's some reason for the government to act, such as a substantial market failure. And we are pushing hard to demand a very fair analysis of both the costs and benefits of regulation. Too often in the previous administration, the benefits were exaggerated and the costs downplayed. And we would like to have as fair an accounting of both of those as possible. And then even when we're satisfied that an agency has legal authority and regulation may be necessary, we want to make sure that agencies work to regulate in a manner that is giving fair notice to the public and in a way that respects due process. And this is a theme on which we've been working very closely with the White House Counsel's Office to ensure that agencies are not proposing new regulatory requirements through guidance or letters or speeches or FAQs on the website. We're striving to change the culture so that when an agency issues guidance, it's truly a guidance about existing requirements and not a backdoor to imposing new regulatory requirements without the process and accountability that's necessary for a legitimate administrative system. So that's some of what we've been up to in the past year. But this event has asked, what's next for the President's regulatory agenda? So let me say a little bit about that. We are in part, focusing on continuing with the momentum that we've built up over the past year with regulatory reform. And in this second year, we want to work closely with agencies to identify some very serious areas and serious and substantial areas for reform. And if you look at the fall unified agenda, you'll see that agencies are proposing some 448 deregulatory actions and 131 regulatory actions, which is a better than 3-for-1 ratio. And as we understand, and I'm sure many of you understand as well, significant deregulation takes time. reconsidering big rules requires new research, it requires new analysis, and of course the full rulemaking process with notice and comment. And so agencies are working to identify areas where reform can have a big impact and produce significant benefits for the American people. And at OIRA, one of the ways we can assist with that is we work often with agencies in cross-cutting areas. Often substantial regulatory regimes involve multiple agencies, and I think this is an area where OIRA can particularly add value. Another thing that we're doing, and we've been doing, and we're going to continue to do in the coming year, is to look closely at some of the statutory authorities that OIRA has for promoting regulatory reform. So one of our main statutes is the Paperwork Reduction Act. Now, paperwork reductions, burdens are not funny, and they often don't make headlines, but they're extremely costly and burdensome. Cass Sunstein, one of my predecessors at OIRA, said that to me before I took this job. He said, don't forget about the paperwork burdens. It often really can impact individuals and small businesses, and there's lots of savings to be had in streamlining or sometimes eliminating paperwork burdens. Also, OIRA has authority under the Congressional Review Act. As you know, the Congressional Review Act was used multiple times this past year to strike down regulations. And the CRA requires that all agencies, including the independent agencies, submit their rules to OIRA for a major determination under the Act. So, which that means basically that when there's a rule, it has to come to OIRA, and OIRA determines whether it imposes more than $100 million in costs. And if it does, then it's major under the meaning of the CRA. And so in part, of course, it's part of our obligation to make sure that agencies are complying with the CRA. And, of course, failure to comply with the CRA can threaten the validity of rules. And we know that Congress takes this very seriously. I think also following the CRA can also promote cost-benefit analysis, because agencies at least have to explain whether their rule is above or below the $100 million threshold. And then another thing that we are considering at OIRA, and the speech in some ways is part of this, is sharing with the public a message of responsible and beneficial regulatory reform. And we want to be quite clear that we are not dismantling important health and safety regulations. We're proceeding with deregulation in a way that is careful, and we're applying the same cost-benefit standards to both regulatory and deregulatory actions. I sometimes hear from critics that, deregulation is just a way to help big business or special interests. But I think if you look closely, you'll see that many regulatory burdens are often put in place by big business or by powerful interest groups. Because regulation often creates barriers to entry. It can limit competition. And when it does that, it can raise costs of ordinary goods and services. It can blunt and stifle innovation. And so what we're really focused on is lifting regulatory requirements that are no longer working for the American people. Okay, so that's some of what we're thinking about for this coming year. And I also wanted to just say something about why we care so much about regulatory reform. Why are we doing this? Why is it so important to the administration? And here I think that there are reasons that are both practical and principled. So let me just start with the practical. Lifting excessive government regulations can really stimulate the economy. In the past few months, there's been a lot of reporting about this. Many economists and commentators have identified a link between this year's booming economic growth and the slowdown in regulatory activity. Even the New York Times ran a story drawing this connection. Other practical effects, of course, removing regulatory burdens can help create jobs and promote innovation. And I think just leaving individuals more free gives them the opportunity to work hard and to do great things. So sort of in sum, one of the most important, I think, practical effects of this administration's initiatives has been to change the environment around this. I think businesses frequently say to me, and individuals have said, that they're no longer fearing arbitrary new burdens being imposed by guidance documents or by new costly regulations. Recently, Mick Mulvaney said in the Wall Street Journal about the CFPB, I think what he said there applies to other agencies as well. This administration is no longer pushing the envelope with regulations. So what are some of the principles behind what we're doing? I think there are a lot of great practical effects, but the principles are also important. And from my perspective, as a former law professor, regulatory reform is part of a larger effort to promote a more constitutional government and thereby to enhance individual liberty. I think our reform efforts help promote constitutional government in a number of ways. So first, I think that there is an important kind of democratic accountability when you have more presidential accountability. And regulatory reform is quite clearly a key component of this administration, and the president has set a very ambitious regulatory policy across the government. And at OIRA and through a centralized review process, we can work with agencies to make sure that they are promoting presidential priorities to eliminate costly and unnecessary burdens. Another way we promote more constitutional government is by highlighting and promoting due process and fair notice, which I mentioned earlier. By cracking down on sub-regulatory guidance, or sometimes called regulatory dark matter, we're ensuring that when agencies impose new requirements, they're following administrative procedures and giving the public notice and an opportunity to comment. I've always found it interesting that one of the ways legal scholars often defend the constitutionality of a very expansive administrative state is that they say agencies can promote constitutional values, or that they follow something like an administrative constitution. Now, of course, by this they mean something quite different from the original Constitution, but be that as it may, I think it's too often the case that agencies often have failed to follow even this much thinner version of constitutionality. And so, at least by requiring agencies to follow administrative procedures, we can ensure notice, public participation, and reasoned decision-making. It's also very important to us in our reform efforts to make sure that we in the executive branch respect the roles of the other departments of government. So we work with agencies to interpret statutes to mean what they say. And by doing that, we respect the lawmaking power of Congress, and we work not to expand the authority of the executive branch beyond what the law allows. Now, admittedly, statutory authority is often open-ended, but agencies should not act as though they have a blank check from Congress to make law. We also work hard to respect the role of the courts in reviewing administrative actions and are mindful both of judicial precedents and process. But perhaps most importantly, I think lifting unnecessary regulatory burdens results in greater individual liberty. Government regulation, of course, can serve vital health and safety goals, and indeed, Congress has ensured that we already live in a highly regulated society. But even against that backdrop, government intervention should still serve a purpose. It shouldn't be a solution in search of a problem. And there are many regulations on our books that are duplicative or outdated or ineffective. Regulations have simply piled on top of regulations, often resulting in a system that no one would have designed on a clean slate. So we are looking closely at those regulations and eliminating excess in order to restore more freedom. When government acts, it should do so in service of the people. And really, those are the principles that motivate us. A regulatory policy that works by promoting economic growth and innovation, and the jobs and the prosperity that accompany greater freedom. So thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the conversation with Ted and questions from the audience. Thank you.